Right now, at this very moment, something remarkable is happening. Or more precisely, something remarkable isn't happening. For the first time in 7 million years, human evolution might have stopped. Not slowed down, stopped. And the weirdest part? We did it to ourselves. Think about that for a second. Every species on Earth is evolving. Right now. This second. Bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. Insects are adapting to pesticides. Birds are changing their migration patterns. Fish are growing smaller in overfished waters. Evolution never stops. It's the fundamental law of life on this planet. Except maybe for us. We're the exception. The rule breaker. The species that looked at 7 million years of evolutionary pressure and said, "Yeah, we're done with that." And somehow, we got away with it. Your ancestors, go back far enough, were constantly being tested by nature. If you couldn't run fast enough, you got eaten. If you couldn't find food during the drought, you starved. If you couldn't handle the cold, you froze. If you were born with a genetic disorder, you probably didn't survive long enough to have kids. Nature was brutal, merciless, and completely indifferent to your suffering. That's how evolution works. It's not pretty, but it's effective. But you're reading this probably lying in bed, or sitting on a couch, in a climate-controlled room, with access to more food than you can eat, protected from predators, diseases mostly under control, and even if you were born with conditions that would have been fatal a few thousand years ago, modern medicine might let you live a completely normal life. You've escaped. We've all escaped. And that escape might be the most significant biological event in human history. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's fascinating. New York at sunrise, Chicago at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching the same story about how we became the species that broke the rules. Here's the paradox that's going to keep scientists arguing for decades. Evolution made humans smart enough to escape evolution. We evolved big brains, opposable thumbs, complex language, and social cooperation. And then we used those exact traits to build a world where evolution can't touch us anymore. It's like evolution created its own off switch. But before you think this is simple, before you assume we've just stopped changing, here's where it gets complicated. Some scientists say we're evolving faster than ever. Others say we stopped 10,000 years ago. Some claim we're on the verge of a new kind of evolution, one we control ourselves. And a few argue that we're actually devolving, getting genetically weaker with each generation. They're all right. And they're all wrong. Because the truth is so much stranger than any single answer. See, evolution isn't one thing. It's a process with multiple mechanisms, and we've managed to shut down some of them while accidentally accelerating others. We've stopped natural selection in most cases, but genetic drift is still happening. We're not adapting to our environment anymore because we've adapted the environment to us instead. We've replaced biological evolution with cultural evolution, and it's happening so fast that our genes can't keep up. The story of how we got here is written in your DNA. It's visible in your skeleton, your immune system, the structure of your brain. It's in the foods you can digest and the diseases you can survive. Every part of your body is a historical document, evidence of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that suddenly, recently, just stopped applying. We're going to trace this entire journey tonight. From the very beginning, when our ancestors were just another ape species trying not to get eaten, all the way to right now, when we're editing our own genes and talking about colonizing other planets. We'll walk through 7 million years of human evolution, see how it worked, understand why it was so brutal, and then watch as our ancestors figured out, piece by piece, how to escape it. We'll explore the moment 10,000 years ago when everything changed. When we stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers and started farming. That's when the Great Escape really began. We'll see how medicine let us survive things that should have killed us. How clothing and shelter let us live in climates that should have been impossible. How modern society has created an environment where natural selection barely functions anymore. And then we'll tackle the big question. The one that keeps evolutionary biologists up at night. Are we still evolving? Is evolution something that can actually stop? And if it has stopped, what does that mean for the future of humanity? The answers are going to surprise you, because the story of human evolution isn't over. It's just entered a phase that's never happened before in the history of life on Earth. A phase where the species itself decides what comes next. So get comfortable. Let your mind relax. And let's figure out together how humans became the species that evolution couldn't hold back. The species that stopped evolving, and what that really means for all of us. Before we can understand why humans might have stopped evolving, we need to talk about what evolution actually is. Because here's the thing. Most people think they understand evolution, but what they're actually carrying around in their heads is a Hollywood version. A simplification that's just close enough to the truth to be dangerous. Evolution isn't progress. It's not a ladder that species climb toward perfection. It's not some cosmic force guiding life toward bigger brains or better bodies. It's something much simpler and much stranger than that. Evolution is what happens when living things make copies of themselves, and those copies aren't quite perfect. That's it. That's the foundation of everything. Imperfect copying plus time equals evolution. But the devil's in the details. And those details are where things get really interesting. Let's start with the mechanism, the engine that drives all evolutionary change. Natural selection. It's such a familiar term that we forget how radical the idea really is. Before researchers published their findings in the mid-19th century, people assumed species were fixed, created as they are and unchanging. The idea that life could transform itself, that fish could become amphibians, that ape-like ancestors could become humans, was borderline heretical. The insight was beautifully simple. Every generation of every species produces more offspring than can possibly survive. A single oak tree might produce thousands of acorns in a season, but only a handful will grow into new trees. A pair of rabbits could theoretically produce millions of descendants in just a few years, but rabbit populations don't explode to infinity. Most rabbits die before reproducing. The question asked was this: which ones survive and which ones die? Is it random, or is there a pattern? The answer changed everything. It's not random. The individuals with traits that help them survive in their specific environment are slightly more likely to reach reproductive age and pass on their genes. The ones with traits that hurt their chances are slightly more likely to die before reproducing. Generation after generation, this tiny bias compounds. The helpful traits become more common. The harmful traits become less common. Over enough time, the population changes. That's natural selection. Not a conscious process, not a plan, just statistics playing out across millions of lives and millions of years. But here's where people get confused. Evolution doesn't mean getting better in any absolute sense. It means getting better adapted to a specific environment at a specific time. A trait that helps you survive in one environment might kill you in another. Thick fur is great if you're a mammoth in the Ice Age, but it's a death sentence if you're suddenly living in the Mojave Desert. This is crucial because it means evolution has no direction, no goal, no endpoint. There's no such thing as a more evolved species or a less evolved species. A bacteria living in your gut is just as evolved as you are. It's been adapting to its environment for exactly as long as your ancestors have been adapting to theirs. It's just that its environment is your intestines, and its adaptations are things like rapid reproduction and chemical resistance, not big brains and opposable thumbs. So how do we actually measure evolution? How do scientists look at a population and say, yes, this is evolving, or no, this has stayed the same? The answer is genes. Specifically, changes in gene frequencies across generations. Every trait you have, from your eye color to your height to your susceptibility to certain diseases, is influenced by genes. These are segments of DNA that code for proteins, and proteins build and run your body. When we talk about evolution, we're really talking about which versions of genes become more or less common in a population over time. This happens through mutation. Every time a cell copies its DNA, there's a tiny chance of making a mistake. Most mutations do nothing. They're in parts of the genome that don't code for anything important, or they make changes so small they don't affect how the organism functions. Some mutations are harmful, causing diseases or reducing survival chances. But a very few, are beneficial. They give the organism some advantage in its environment. When a beneficial mutation appears, natural selection can spread it through the population. The individual with the mutation is slightly more likely to survive and reproduce. Their children inherit the mutation, and if they also have better survival odds, they pass it on to their children. Over many generations, what started as a random copying error in one individual's DNA becomes a standard feature of the entire species. This process takes time, a lot of time. To get major evolutionary changes, the kind that turn one species into another, you typically need millions of years. This is because most beneficial mutations provide only tiny advantages, maybe a 1 or 2% better chance of survival. That tiny advantage needs thousands of generations to spread through the entire population. And that's just for one mutation. To get complex adaptations like wings or eyes or human intelligence, you need hundreds or thousands of beneficial mutations, all accumulating and building on each other. Think of it like compound interest. Put a penny in a savings account with 1% interest, and you barely notice the growth for years. But leave it for thousands of years, and that penny turns into a fortune. Evolution works the same way. Tiny advantages compound across geological timescales until you get transformations that seem impossible. But here's where things get weird. Evolution doesn't always move at the same speed. Sometimes it crawls along so slowly that species barely change for millions of years. Alligators in the Everglades have looked basically the same for millions of years. These animals found body plans that worked incredibly well for their environments, and they've stuck with them. Not because they stopped evolving, they're still accumulating mutations, still experiencing natural selection, but because any major changes would make them worse at what they do. This is called evolutionary stasis, and it's more common than people realize. Most species, most of the time, aren't transforming into something else. They're just maintaining the adaptations they already have. Then occasionally, something changes. The environment shifts dramatically, a new predator appears, a disease sweeps through, a population gets isolated on an island like Hawaii. Suddenly, the old adaptations aren't good enough anymore. Natural selection intensifies. The population either adapts quickly or goes extinct. And when I say quickly, I mean quickly in evolutionary terms, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of years instead of millions. This is called punctuated equilibrium. Long periods of stasis interrupted by relatively rapid bursts of change. It's how we get strange things like the unique birds on the Hawaiian Islands, splitting into different species in just a few million years, each adapted to different food sources. Or consider the peppered moth in industrial regions like Pittsburgh or Detroit during the manufacturing boom. Before industrialization, most peppered moths were light-colored, which camouflaged them against light-colored tree bark. Dark-colored moths existed, but were rare because birds could spot and eat them easily. Then pollution from factories darkened the trees. Suddenly, the light moths stood out and the dark moths were camouflaged. Within 50 years, dark moths went from rare to common. That's evolution in real time, observable across a human lifetime. But that was just a color change, one gene switching from one variant to another. The moths didn't develop new organs or new behaviors. For that kind of major change, you need more time and more environmental pressure. Or do you? Some scientists think rapid evolution might be more common than we realized, especially in small populations facing extreme environmental stress. This brings us back to humans and to that bottleneck 900,000 years ago. 1,280 individuals struggling to survive for 117,000 years in the worst climate conditions in human history. That's exactly the kind of scenario that could trigger rapid evolutionary change. Small population, intense selection pressure, long time frame. And something did change during that bottleneck. Our ancestors went in as one species and came out as something different. Something with the genetic and behavioral tools to eventually dominate the planet. The question is, did evolution stop after that? Or is it still happening, just in ways we don't recognize? Because here's what most people don't understand. Evolution never truly stops. As long as organisms are reproducing and dying at different rates, as long as mutations are happening, as long as environments are changing, natural selection continues. It might slow down. It might become harder to detect. But it never stops completely. Even in modern humans with our medicine and technology, some genes are becoming more common while others become less common. That's evolution by definition. The question isn't whether we're still evolving. The question is whether the evolution we're experiencing now is different from what came before. Whether we've somehow broken free from the normal rules that govern every other species on Earth. To understand if humans have stopped evolving in any meaningful sense, we first need to understand how we got here. Because the story of human evolution isn't a steady march from primitive to advanced. It's a story of rapid changes and long stagnations, of near extinctions and explosive expansions, of environments changing and populations adapting or dying. It's a story that makes sense only when you understand the foundation, the mechanisms of evolution that have been shaping life on Earth for 3.8 billion years. And it's a story that's far from over. Because if there's one thing evolution teaches us, it's that nothing stays the same forever. The world keeps changing. And life, including human life, has to change with it or face extinction. So let's trace that journey. Let's follow our ancestors from the primeval forests 7 million years ago to the modern world of cities and smartphones. Let's see how evolution shaped us. And then we can ask the really interesting question, is it still shaping us now? Because here's the thing about leaving the forest. It completely transforms the game. In the trees, you need long arms for swinging, grasping feet for gripping branches, bodies built for climbing. But on the ground, different rules apply. And your ancestors did something almost no other primate had ever done successfully. They stood up. Bipedalism. Walking upright on two legs. It sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most revolutionary adaptations in mammalian history. It freed the hands for carrying things, tools, food, infants. It raised the head higher, improving visibility over tall grass. It reduced the body surface exposed to the brutal midday sun, keeping them cooler in the intense heat. Then came the bottleneck. That genetic near extinction we talked about earlier. 930,000 years ago, human populations crashed to perhaps 1,280 breeding individuals. For 117,000 years, they teetered on the edge of extinction, and when they finally recovered around 813,000 years ago, they had been fundamentally transformed. The survivors spread rapidly, colonizing territories that had been empty for millennia. But they weren't spreading as one unified population. They were splitting into three groups that would follow their own evolutionary paths, adapting to different environments, developing unique features. But all carried the genetic signatures of the bottleneck, the fused chromosome, the reduced diversity, the neural adaptations selected for during those desperate years. The original population stayed relatively generalized. They needed adaptability because their environments were still fluctuating, still unpredictable. Natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving, behavioral flexibility. The populations that moved north into colder regions faced different challenges. Colder temperatures, extreme seasonality, different prey animals. They became the Neanderthals, robust and cold-adapted, with larger nasal passages and incredibly strong builds. The groups that went east became Denisovans, about whom we know less, but genetic evidence shows they adapted to everything from high-altitude plateaus to tropical islands. For hundreds of thousands of years, these three lineages evolved separately, accumulating differences, developing distinct physical and cultural characteristics. Then, around 300,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. The main population became anatomically modern. Homo sapiens. This wasn't a sudden transformation. It was gradual, regional, complicated. Different modern human traits appeared at different times in different places. But by 300,000 years ago, there were people who, if you dressed them in modern clothes, would pass unremarked on a street in New York today. Same height range, same bone structure, same brain size. But here's what's wild. They didn't act modern yet. For the next 200,000 years, these anatomically modern humans used essentially the same stone tools their ancestors had been making for hundreds of thousands of years. They hunted the same way, lived in the same kinds of groups, left the same kinds of archaeological traces. Then around 100,000 years ago, something shifted. Behavioral modernity. Suddenly, the archaeological record explodes with innovation. Sophisticated art, intricate beadwork, complex projectile weapons, elaborate burial practices, evidence of long-distance trade networks, symbolic artifacts that suggest abstract thinking and possibly religion. What caused this change? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe a genetic mutation improved language abilities. Maybe population growth reached a critical threshold where ideas could spread and build on each other. Maybe climate stress forced innovation. Whatever the trigger, by 70,000 years ago, modern humans were doing things no species had ever done before. They were creating culture that could evolve faster than genes, accumulating knowledge across generations, adapting to new environments through technology and social organization rather than just biological evolution. And then they migrated. Around 60,000 years ago, a small group, maybe just a few hundred people, began moving into new territories like the Arabian Peninsula. They probably didn't know they were making history. They were just following resources, looking for better territories, doing what humans had always done, moving, exploring, adapting. But this time was different, because these weren't archaic humans anymore. These were modern humans, equipped with advanced technology, complex language, and the cultural toolkit that would let them colonize every environment on Earth. Within just 50,000 years, an eye blink in evolutionary time, their descendants had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They crossed deserts and mountains, paddled across open ocean, eventually walked across land bridges into the Americas. And everywhere they went, they adapted. This is where the last major physical changes happened. The ones we can actually track in historical time. Northern populations developed lighter skin, not because of any inherent superiority, but because of simple physics and biochemistry. Dark skin protects against intense UV radiation, preventing DNA damage and preserving folate, a vitamin crucial for fetal development. In tropical environments, dark skin is essential. But in northern latitudes with weak sun, like the Pacific Northwest, dark skin becomes a disadvantage. You need UV radiation to produce vitamin D, and if you don't get enough, your bones weaken, your immune system suffers, you're more likely to die before reproducing. So natural selection favored mutations that reduced melanin production. This happened independently in different northern regions, different genetic mutations producing similar results. Convergent evolution in action. The adaptation happened fast, probably within just 10,000 to 20,000 years. Fast enough that we can see it in the genetic record, trace the specific mutations that spread through populations. The same thing happened with lactose tolerance. Originally, all humans were lactose intolerant after weaning, like most mammals. We couldn't digest milk sugar as adults. But when some populations began herding cattle around 10,000 years ago, suddenly there was strong selection pressure for the ability to digest milk. Individuals with mutations that kept lactase enzyme production active into adulthood could extract nutrition from a resource their neighbors couldn't use. They had more children, passed on the genes, and within just a few thousand years, lactose tolerance had spread through dairy farming populations. This is one of the fastest, most dramatic examples of natural selection in recent human history. We can literally watch it happening in the genetic record. And yet, and this is the puzzle, despite these recent changes, despite clear evidence that natural selection was still acting on human populations just a few thousand years ago, something seems to have changed. Look at your ancestors from 10,000 years ago. They were shorter on average, had different facial structures, often different skull shapes. Go back 50,000 years, and the differences become even more pronounced. Heavier brow ridges, more robust skeletons, different proportions. But look at people from 2,000 years ago, a Native American chief from the Mississippi period, for example, and they're basically identical to us. Same height range, same facial features, same body proportions. An ancestor from the time of Christ would look perfectly normal in a modern American office. Something happened. Something that seems to have stopped, or at least dramatically slowed the physical evolution that had been transforming humanity for millions of years. The question is, what? And more importantly, why? Because here's the thing. Natural selection doesn't just stop. It can't. As long as some individuals reproduce more than others, evolution continues. But the nature of that selection can change dramatically. And for humans, starting around 10,000 years ago, something fundamental shifted in how natural selection acted on our populations. That shift began with the agricultural revolution. And understanding what happened next requires understanding what farming actually did to human evolution. Because the answer isn't what most people think. For millions of years, your ancestors lived the same basic lifestyle. Wake up. Find food. Don't get eaten. Make babies. Repeat. They were hunter-gatherers, following animal herds, tracking seasonal plants, moving constantly in small groups of maybe 20 to 50 people. This was the human way of life. Not for centuries or millennia, but for literally millions of years. From the earliest proto-humans walking upright to the sophisticated modern humans spreading across the continents, the fundamental survival strategy remained unchanged. Move around, exploit whatever resources you can find, keep your group small enough to feed. Then 10,000 years ago, everything changed. And I mean everything. In a handful of river valleys scattered across the world, from the Mississippi to the Nile, humans made a decision that would alter the course of evolution itself. They decided to stop moving. They looked at wild plants growing along riverbanks and thought, what if instead of traveling to find food, we made the food come to us? What if we stopped chasing animals and started keeping them? What if we built permanent shelters and stayed in one place? It sounds simple, almost obvious in hindsight. But this was the most revolutionary idea in human history. We call it the agricultural revolution, but that name doesn't capture the magnitude of what happened. This wasn't just a new way of getting food. This was humans deciding to take control of nature itself, to reshape the environment to suit our needs instead of adapting ourselves to fit the environment. And here's the really wild part. It happened independently in at least 7 different places around the world. The ancient river valleys of the East, the highlands of New Guinea, central Mexico, the Andes, the eastern woodlands of what is now the United States. These populations had no contact with each other. They didn't share knowledge or trade ideas. But within a few thousand years of each other, they all made the same fundamental leap. They all figured out that you could plant seeds, harvest the results, save some seeds for next year, and repeat. They all realized you could capture wild animals, keep them in enclosures, breed them selectively, and create a permanent supply of meat, milk, and leather. The first crops were barely recognizable as food. Early grains were scrawny grasses with tiny seeds protected by hard shells. Wild rice was even worse. Wild corn in North America was a scraggly plant that produced maybe 5 or 6 small kernels. Nothing like the fat, golden ears we see in Iowa fields today. But early farmers had stumbled onto something more powerful than any tool their ancestors had invented. They had discovered evolution itself, and they were using it as a technology. Every year, they saved seeds from the plants that produced the most food, the easiest to harvest, the best tasting. Every generation, they bred animals that were most docile, most productive, most useful. They were practicing artificial selection, the same process modern biology would recognize thousands of years later. Except they were doing it without any understanding of genetics or evolution. They just knew what worked. Within just a few thousand years, these early farmers had transformed wild plants and animals into something entirely new. Wheat with enormous seed heads. Rice with tender grains that didn't scatter when harvested. Corn that produced massive ears packed with hundreds of kernels. Cattle that were docile enough to handle, but large enough to provide enormous amounts of meat and milk. Dogs that would herd sheep instead of hunting them. The archaeological record shows this transformation happening at breathtaking speed. Sites from 9,000 years ago show evidence of plants that are starting to change, becoming slightly larger, slightly more useful. By 7,000 years ago, the transformation is obvious. These aren't wild plants anymore. They're domesticated crops that couldn't survive without human cultivation. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while humans were busy evolving their food sources, something else was happening. Something nobody planned or anticipated. Agriculture was creating entirely new selection pressures on humans themselves. Think about what farming actually requires. You need to stay in one place for years, decades, generations. You need to clear land, plant seeds, tend crops for months before you can harvest. You need to store grain for the winter and save seed for next spring. You need to build permanent structures, dig wells, create irrigation systems. Most importantly, you need way more people than a hunter-gatherer band could support. Because here's the thing about farming. It's incredibly labor-intensive. Clearing fields, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing grain. It all takes enormous amounts of work. A hunter-gatherer might spend 20 to 30 hours a week finding food. Early farmers were working 60, 70, maybe 80 hours a week to produce the same number of calories. Sounds terrible, right? Why would anyone choose that? The answer is that farming wasn't about making life easier. It was about making more people possible. 1 acre of farmed land could support 10 to 100 times more people than 1 acre of wild landscape. You could have way more children because you didn't need to carry them while traveling. You could feed them grain mash instead of breast milk, reducing the spacing between births. You could support elderly people who couldn't travel but could still help with farming tasks. Within just a few generations, farming communities were exploding in population. Villages that started with maybe 50 people were growing to 500, then 5,000. The first true cities appeared around 6,000 years ago. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, eventually grew to maybe 20,000 people. This was unprecedented. There had never been such concentrations of humans living in one place in the entire history of our species. And this population explosion created something humans had never experienced before: constant, intimate contact with thousands of other people. Hunter-gatherer bands were small enough that everyone knew everyone. If someone got sick, you could avoid them or leave them behind. But in a city, you were constantly surrounded by strangers. Living in houses that shared walls, drinking water from communal wells, shopping in crowded markets. This was the perfect environment for disease. And disease came with a vengeance. Living in permanent settlements meant living in your own waste. No more moving to a fresh campsite every few weeks. Now human waste accumulated in streets and water supplies. Pathogens that would have died out in small, mobile populations could now spread like wildfire through dense urban populations. Even worse, farmers lived in close contact with their animals. Cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, all crammed into pens and barns, living right alongside human families. This created something that had never existed before: a bridge for diseases to jump from animals to humans. Most of the infectious diseases that plague humanity, measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, all of them originated in domesticated animals. Measles jumped from cattle. Smallpox probably came from camels or cattle. Influenza from pigs and birds. These diseases couldn't have existed in hunter-gatherer populations. They require large, dense populations to sustain transmission. But in agricultural societies, they flourished. The archaeological evidence is brutal. Skeletons from early farming communities show much higher rates of disease and malnutrition than hunter-gatherer populations. Early farmers were shorter, had worse teeth, showed signs of vitamin deficiencies and chronic infections. Average life expectancy probably dropped when agriculture was adopted. Child mortality rates were horrifying. So why did farming spread? Why did it take over the world if it made people sicker and worked them harder? Because it produced more people. Communities that adopted farming could support larger populations. Larger populations meant more warriors, more laborers, more innovation. When farmers encountered hunter-gatherers, the farmers had superior numbers. They could field armies. They could afford to lose battles and still come back. They could slowly, relentlessly push hunter-gatherers off the best land. Within just a few thousand years, farming had spread across the entire globe. Not because it was better for individual humans, but because it was better for human populations. But here's where the evolutionary story gets really wild. All these new selection pressures, the diseases, the dietary changes, the different lifestyle, they started changing human genetics. Fast. In regions that had adopted dairy farming, populations faced a problem. Adult humans aren't supposed to digest milk. Like all mammals, we produce an enzyme called lactase as infants to break down milk sugars. But after weaning, lactase production shuts down. Drink milk as an adult, and you get sick. Cramps, diarrhea, gas. But farmers had cattle producing milk year-round. This was potentially thousands of extra calories per day, enormous nutritional value. Any genetic variant that allowed adults to keep producing lactase would provide massive survival advantages. The genetic evidence shows exactly what happened. A mutation that kept lactase production turned on throughout life appeared in these populations. Individuals with this mutation could drink milk without getting sick. They had access to more calories and more nutrition. They had more children who survived to adulthood. Within just a few thousand years, lactose tolerance went from being vanishingly rare to being a dominant trait in dairy farming populations. This is evolution happening in fast forward. Not millions of years, not hundreds of thousands. Just a few thousand years, maybe 200 to 300 generations, and a major genetic change swept through entire populations. Similar changes were happening with diet. Farming societies that relied heavily on starchy crops faced different nutritional challenges than meat-heavy hunter-gatherer diets. Populations evolved changes in genes related to starch digestion, vitamin production, and metabolism. In high-altitude farming communities, selection favored genetic variants that helped process oxygen more efficiently in thin air. In regions where agriculture had created standing water perfect for mosquito breeding, selection favored genetic variants that provided some resistance to mosquito-borne diseases. But here's what makes all this different from everything that came before. For the first time in human history, we weren't just adapting to our environment. We were creating our environment. Every dam we built, every forest we cleared, every animal we domesticated, it changed the selection pressures acting on us. We were caught in a feedback loop. Agriculture changed human genetics. Those genetic changes made us better adapted to agricultural lifestyles. That success encouraged more agriculture, denser populations, more environmental modification, which created new selection pressures, which drove more genetic changes, faster and faster, accelerating over thousands of years. And humans were getting better at controlling their environment with every generation. Early farmers could barely survive crop failures. But over millennia, they developed technologies to manage risk. Irrigation systems to control water. Storage facilities to save food for bad years. Trade networks to move surplus food from productive regions to struggling ones. They learned to predict weather patterns, to recognize signs of drought or flood. They developed social systems to coordinate large-scale projects, to organize labor for building and harvest. Most importantly, they developed knowledge systems to preserve and transmit agricultural expertise. Writing, which appeared around 5,000 years ago, allowed farmers to record crop yields, track seasons, document successful techniques. For the first time, knowledge could be preserved outside of human memory, passed down through generations without degradation. This was the beginning of humans controlling their own evolution. Not through genetic changes, though those were still happening, but through cultural and technological changes that happened far faster than biological evolution ever could. By 2,000 years ago, the transformation was complete. The entire world, or at least everywhere humans could farm, had been converted to agriculture. Hunter-gatherers survived only in marginal environments, deserts, Arctic regions, dense rainforests, places where farming was impossible, and human populations had exploded to levels that would have been unimaginable to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Estimates suggest there might have been 300 million humans alive by 2,000 years ago. Remember that bottleneck 900,000 years earlier? Those 1,280 breeding individuals clinging to survival? Their descendants now numbered in the hundreds of millions. And they were living in a world they had created, eating crops they had designed, living in cities they had built, protected by technologies they had invented. For the first time in history, the primary selection pressure on humans wasn't nature. It was other humans. Competition between societies, warfare, trade, cultural exchange, these were the forces shaping human evolution now. The agricultural revolution had accomplished something no species had ever done before. It had allowed humans to step outside the normal rules of evolution, to create their own environment instead of adapting to nature's demands. But it was just the beginning, because what came next would make the agricultural revolution look like a dress rehearsal. The real transformation was still to come. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that would change the rules of natural selection more profoundly than anything in the previous 7 million years of human evolution. Around 200 years ago, humans invented a way to cheat death. Not permanently, not completely, but consistently enough to break the fundamental mechanism that had shaped every living thing since the origin of life itself. We invented modern medicine. Here's what that actually means. For millions of years, natural selection worked through a simple, brutal mechanism. Individuals with genetic variants that made them less fit for their environment died before they could reproduce. Those genes disappeared from the population. Individuals with beneficial variants survived, reproduced, and passed those genes on. Over thousands of generations, this process refined every species, eliminated harmful mutations, selected for advantageous traits. It was automatic, pitiless, utterly indifferent to individual suffering. But it worked. It had created everything from bacteria to blue whales, from fungi to humans. It was the engine of evolution, and it ran on death. Then we figured out how to stop it. Start with something simple. Eyeglasses. Before the 13th century, if you were born severely nearsighted or farsighted, you were at a massive disadvantage. You couldn't hunt effectively. You couldn't gather food efficiently. You were more likely to have accidents, less likely to contribute to your community's survival. In hunter-gatherer societies, severe vision problems probably reduced your chances of surviving to reproductive age. Natural selection was actively removing genes for poor vision from the population. Then someone in Italy invented corrective lenses. Suddenly, vision problems became trivial. You put on a piece of ground glass, and you could see as well as anyone else. The selective pressure vanished instantly. People with genes for nearsightedness, farsightedness, astigmatism, they all survived and reproduced at the same rates as people with perfect vision. Those genes that would have been gradually eliminated stayed in the population, spread, multiplied. Today, roughly 75% of adults in developed countries need vision correction. 3/4 of the population carrying genes that would have been selected against for millions of years. And nobody cares, because we solved the problem technologically. We bypassed evolution entirely. But eyeglasses are just the beginning. They're the simplest, most obvious example of how technology can override natural selection. The real revolution happened in the 20th century, when we figured out how to keep people alive who would have died from conditions far more serious than poor vision. Consider type 1 diabetes. It's a genetic condition where your pancreas can't produce insulin, the hormone that regulates blood sugar. Before 1922, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes was a death sentence. Children who developed it would waste away over a few months or years. Adults might last slightly longer, but the outcome was always the same: death. usually before reproductive age. Natural selection eliminated genes for type 1 diabetes with ruthless efficiency. Then, in 1922, researchers discovered how to extract and purify insulin. Suddenly, type 1 diabetes became manageable. Not cured, not eliminated, but manageable. A daily injection could keep blood sugar regulated indefinitely. People with type 1 diabetes could live normal lifespans, have families, pass those genes on to the next generation. The selective pressure vanished overnight. Today, millions of people with type 1 diabetes live full lives, have children, contribute to society. Genes that would have been eliminated from the population 100 years ago are now being actively transmitted to the next generation. Evolution didn't solve the problem. Technology did. Or take antibiotics. This one's even more dramatic. Before the 20th century, bacterial infections were one of the leading causes of death worldwide. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. Pneumonia, strep throat, tuberculosis, these weren't just inconveniences. They were death sentences. Millions died every year from infections we now consider trivial. Natural selection was constantly testing human populations for resistance to bacterial diseases. People with more robust immune systems survived. Those with weaker immunity died before they could reproduce. Generation by generation, humans were being selected for disease resistance. It was happening slowly, but it was happening. Then we invented antibiotics. Within a few decades, bacterial infections went from being major killers to minor inconveniences. You get strep throat, you take penicillin for a week, you're fine. You develop pneumonia, a course of antibiotics, and you're back at work. The selective pressure disappeared almost completely. People with genetic variants that made them more susceptible to bacterial infections now survive and reproduce at the same rates as those with more robust immunity. The implications are staggering. We're not just preserving individual lives. We're preserving entire categories of genetic variants that natural selection would have eliminated. We're changing the genetic composition of the human species in ways that would have been impossible before modern medicine. But perhaps the most profound impact has been on infant mortality. This is where natural selection hits hardest. Because here's the thing about evolution. It doesn't care about old people. Once you're past reproductive age, natural selection essentially ignores you. But infants and children, that's where the selective pressure is most intense. Any genetic condition that kills children before they can reproduce gets eliminated fast. For most of human history, infant mortality was horrifyingly high. In hunter-gatherer societies, roughly 40% of children died before age 15. In agricultural societies, it was even worse in some periods. 50% or more of children never made it to adulthood. They died from infections, from genetic conditions, from complications during birth, from malnutrition, from accidents. Natural selection was brutal, relentless, constantly culling the population. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, everything changed. Germ theory led to better hygiene. Clean water systems prevented waterborne diseases. Vaccination eliminated killers like smallpox and polio. Better nutrition improved overall health. Medical interventions saved babies who would have died during or shortly after birth. The numbers are almost unbelievable. In 1900, the infant mortality rate in the United States was about 165 deaths per 1,000 live births. Today, it's under 6 per 1,000. We went from losing 1 in 6 babies to losing 1 in 170. In just over a century, we reduced infant mortality by more than 95%. Think about what that means for evolution. 4 million years, roughly half of all humans died before reproducing. Natural selection could work with that. It was a massive filter, constantly removing harmful genetic variants from the population. Now, in developed countries, nearly everyone survives to reproductive age. The filter is gone. Almost every genetic variant, beneficial or harmful, gets passed to the next generation. We've got people with cystic fibrosis living into their 40s and 50s, having children. A generation ago, most died in childhood. We've got people with hemophilia living normal lifespans thanks to clotting factor treatments. We've got people with severe allergies surviving because of EpiPens and emergency medicine. We've got people with congenital heart defects living full lives after surgical repairs. Each of these conditions would have been eliminated by natural selection. Each represents a genetic variant that reduces survival fitness in a natural environment. But we don't live in a natural environment anymore. We live in a medical environment. An environment where technology compensates for genetic vulnerabilities. And it's not just genetic conditions. It's everything. People with weakened immune systems survive thanks to antibiotics and antivirals. People with poor physical fitness survive because they don't need to hunt or gather food. People with mental health conditions survive because of therapy and medication. People with disabilities survive because of assistive technologies and social support systems. The scope is almost impossible to comprehend. We're preserving genetic diversity that evolution would have eliminated. We're keeping variants in the population that would have disappeared thousands of years ago. We're fundamentally altering the genetic trajectory of our species. But here's where it gets complicated. Is this a bad thing? Evolution doesn't have goals. It doesn't optimize for human happiness or societal good. It just selects for reproductive success in a particular environment. A gene that causes suffering but doesn't prevent reproduction isn't selected against. A gene that reduces quality of life but allows survival and breeding sticks around. Natural selection is blind to everything except reproductive fitness. So when we use medicine to preserve genetic variants that would have been eliminated, are we accumulating harmful mutations? Are we degrading the human genome? Some people worry about this. They imagine a future where humans are genetically weaker, more dependent on technology, less able to survive without medical intervention. But that worry misunderstands what's happening. We're not getting weaker. We're changing the environment. 4 million years, human evolution was shaped by a harsh natural environment where small genetic disadvantages could mean death. Now, we've created an environment where those disadvantages are compensated for technologically. We haven't stopped evolving. We've changed what we're evolving for. Think about it this way. Is someone with type 1 diabetes less fit, in an evolutionary sense, if they can live a full life, have children, and contribute to society? Only if you define fitness as ability to survive without insulin injections. But that's an arbitrary definition based on a particular environment. In the environment we've actually created, the environment with insulin available, they're just as fit as anyone else. The same logic applies to every medical intervention. We haven't defeated evolution. We've harnessed it. We've created an environment where human cooperation and technological innovation provide survival advantages that outweigh individual genetic vulnerabilities. But there's another layer to this. One that's even more profound. Medical technology doesn't just preserve existing genetic variants. It's creating new selective pressures. Different pressures. Pressures that favor different traits than those favored in our ancestral environment. In a world with modern medicine, individual genetic fitness matters less. But social cooperation matters more. The ability to create and maintain complex technological systems matters more. The capacity for abstract reasoning and long-term planning matters more. We're selecting for different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of social skills. Consider how humans survived before modern medicine. You needed a robust immune system, physical strength, acute senses, high pain tolerance. Those were the traits natural selection favored. Now, those traits still matter, but they matter less. What matters more is the ability to navigate complex social systems, access medical care, understand health information, comply with treatment regimens. We're selecting for social intelligence, for the ability to work within technological systems. 4 traits that allow individuals to thrive in complex, interconnected societies. This isn't the end of evolution. It's a redirection of evolution toward new selective pressures that we've created. And here's the really wild part. We're doing it consciously. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a species is aware of the evolutionary forces acting on it and is deliberately modifying those forces. We're not just subject to evolution. We're participants in it. We're shaping our own evolutionary future through the choices we make about medical technology, reproductive decisions, and social organization. But this creates ethical questions that our ancestors never had to face. If we can keep anyone alive regardless of their genetic makeup, should we? If we can select embryos for certain traits, which traits should we select for? If we can edit genes to eliminate diseases, which genes should we edit? These aren't questions about survival anymore. They're questions about values, about what kind of species we want to become. And unlike our ancestors, who had to accept whatever hand natural selection dealt them, we have choices. Real choices about the genetic future of our species. That's both exhilarating and terrifying, because for the first time, we're responsible for our own evolution. The decisions we make in the next few generations will shape human genetics for thousands of years to come. Natural selection hasn't stopped. It's just taken on a new form. Instead of being shaped by environmental pressures we can't control, we're being shaped by the technological and social environments we create. Instead of evolution happening to us, we're making evolution happen. And that changes everything. 4 millions of years, where you lived determined what you became. If your ancestors stayed in the Arctic, natural selection gave them shorter limbs and stockier builds to conserve heat. If they moved to high altitudes, evolution crafted their blood to carry oxygen more efficiently. If they settled in tropical regions, their bodies adapted to shed heat and resist specific diseases. Geography was destiny. Climate was a selective force as powerful as any predator. Then about 100,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. Humans started cheating. It began simply enough. Animal skins wrapped around bodies. Fire brought inside caves. Crude shelters built to block wind and rain. Nothing fancy, nothing that would have impressed our modern sensibilities. But these simple innovations fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and their environment. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species was creating its own microclimate. Think about what this means. A human living in Ice Age conditions didn't need to wait hundreds of thousands of years for natural selection to give them thicker skin or more efficient metabolism. They just needed to figure out how to keep a fire burning through the night, how to cure animal hides properly, how to build a windbreak that didn't collapse in storms. The selective pressure was shifting from biological adaptation to technological innovation. Fast forward to today. Right now, as you're listening to this, humans are living in places that should absolutely, 100%, kill them within hours. Antarctica, Death Valley, the Sahara Desert, the top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the ocean in research submarines, the International Space Station orbiting 250 miles above Earth's surface. Not just surviving in these places, but living there, working there. Some people even choosing to stay there year-round. This shouldn't be possible. Every single one of these environments presents conditions that the naked human body cannot survive. We have no fur for the cold, no specialized respiratory system for thin air, no biological mechanism to handle 130-degree heat or negative 80-degree cold. We're tropical apes. Our bodies are designed for the African savanna, not the Arctic tundra or the Mojave Desert or the vacuum of space. But we're there anyway, thriving, in fact. How? The answer is layers upon layers of technological adaptation. Clothing isn't just fabric anymore. It's advanced synthetic materials designed to wick moisture while retaining heat, or reflect heat while allowing ventilation, or provide insulation against cold so extreme it would freeze your skin in seconds. We've engineered materials that our evolutionary ancestors couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. And clothing is just the beginning. Heating systems let us live comfortably in places where winter temperatures regularly drop to negative 40 degrees. Not just survive, mind you, but live in heated homes wearing t-shirts and shorts while blizzards rage outside. We've essentially eliminated winter as a selective pressure for huge portions of humanity. Air conditioning has done the same thing for heat. Phoenix, Arizona, has a population of over 1.7 million people. The average summer temperature there is 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Before air conditioning became widespread in the 1950s, Phoenix had maybe 100,000 residents. Now it's one of the fastest-growing cities in America. People are voluntarily moving to a desert that would have been considered uninhabitable for permanent settlement throughout most of human history. And they're not suffering. They're not struggling to survive. They're living in climate-controlled comfort, their homes maintained at a pleasant 72 degrees while the outside world tries to cook them alive. This is evolution by proxy. We're not adapting our bodies to the environment. We're adapting the environment to our bodies. The implications are staggering. For millions of years, if you lived in the far north, you needed biological cold adaptations. Shorter limbs to reduce heat loss. Higher metabolic rates to generate more body heat. Different fat distribution. These traits were selected for because individuals without them died before reproducing. The environment killed anyone who wasn't genetically suited to survive it. Now, a person with genetic ancestry from tropical regions can move to Alaska and live there comfortably for their entire life. They don't need generations of adaptation. They don't need natural selection to reshape their biology. They just need a good coat, a heated home, and modern infrastructure. The selective pressure has vanished. Think about the traditional Inuit peoples of Alaska. They developed remarkable biological and cultural adaptations to one of Earth's harshest environments. Compact body shapes for heat conservation. Cultural knowledge about building igloos, hunting seals, surviving on the ice. This adaptation took thousands of years. Today, anyone with a credit card and internet access can order Arctic survival gear that will keep them alive in the same conditions. No genetic adaptation required. No generational knowledge necessary. Just technology. We've effectively decoupled human survival from human biology. But it goes deeper than just temperature control. We're talking about the complete elimination of geographical isolation, the force that has driven speciation throughout evolutionary history. Remember how modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans diverged into separate species. Geographic separation was essential to that process. Populations moved into different environments, faced different selective pressures, and accumulated different genetic changes over hundreds of thousands of years. They were cut off from each other by mountains, oceans, deserts. They evolved in isolation. Today, there is no isolation. You can fly from New York to Sydney in a day. You can video chat with someone in Tokyo in real time. We are constantly mixing, moving, sharing genes and ideas across the entire planet. The genetic barriers that once separated human populations are dissolving. We are becoming a single, global gene pool. And that means the kind of divergent evolution that creates new species, the kind that turned Homo erectus into us and Neanderthals, is practically impossible on Earth today. Unless, of course, we leave Earth. If we establish colonies on Mars, or the Moon, or stations in deep space, isolation returns. The distance between Earth and Mars is vast. Communication has a time delay. Travel is difficult and expensive. A Martian colony would be genetically isolated from Earth in a way no human population has been for thousands of years. And the environment on Mars is radically different. Lower gravity, higher radiation, different atmosphere. Natural selection would kick in with a vengeance. The people who survive and reproduce on Mars will be the ones whose bodies can handle the radiation, whose bones don't deteriorate in low gravity, whose psychology can withstand the confinement and isolation. Over generations, they would drift away from Earth humans. They would evolve. They might eventually become a new species, Homo martis. But even there, technology complicates things. Would we let natural selection take its course on Mars? Or would we use genetic engineering to pre-adapt our colonists? Would we edit their genes to make them radiation-resistant before they even leave Earth? Would we use technology to shield them so completely that their bodies don't need to change? The future of human evolution on other worlds will be a tug-of-war between the raw power of natural selection and our increasing ability to control it. Back on Earth, we're facing a different kind of future, one where we might choose to direct our own evolution. We have the tools. We have CRISPR. We have the knowledge. The only thing stopping us is ethics and regulation. But history suggests that if a technology is possible and offers an advantage, someone, somewhere, will eventually use it. We might be on the verge of a new era of designer evolution, where parents choose traits for their children, where we eliminate genetic diseases not by chance but by choice, where we enhance human abilities beyond what nature provided. This is a profound responsibility. We are taking the reins of a process that has guided life for billions of years. We are stepping into the driver's seat of evolution, and we're doing it without a map. We don't know where this road leads. We don't know the unintended consequences of tampering with our own genome. We don't know what we might lose in our quest to improve ourselves. But we do know one thing: we can't go back. We can't return to the slow, blind process of natural selection. We've opened the door to directed evolution, and we have to walk through it. So, have humans stopped evolving? No. We're evolving faster than ever. But the rules have changed. The game has changed. And for the first time, we're the ones making the moves. The future of humanity isn't written in the stars or in our genes. It's written in the choices we make today, tomorrow, and in the centuries to come. We are the architects of our own evolution, and that is the most exciting and terrifying thing of all. As you drift off to sleep, think about that. You are part of a species that has defied the odds, broken the rules, and taken control of its own destiny. You are the result of millions of years of survival, adaptation, and innovation. and you are part of the generation that will decide what comes next. Sweet dreams.